مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أداة أميركا كان ذلك ما أعلنه الرئيس بايدن في أول يوم له في منصبه، ولهذه العبارة معاني كثيرة، بداية من الطاقة المتجددة في إجراءات التلقيح إلى موافقة الكونغرس على خطة تحفيزية ضخمة. أداة أميركا ترتبط كذلك بالسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، حيث تسلط الضوء على العودة إلى الالتزامات بالمعاهدات وإنعاش التحالفات والتركيز على الدبلوماسية النشطة لتعزيز المصالح الأمريكية. الدبلوماسية في صميمها تتعلق بالأشخاص، السفراء والدبلوماسيون والموظفون القنصليون والعاملون بالتنمية، بالإضافة إلى ملايين الأميركيين الذين يمثلون بلدنا من رجال الأعمال والطلاب والمسافرين المتنقلين حول العالم. وإذا يعود العالم ليفتح أبوابه في أعقاب الجائحة، سننهي أزمتنا الوطنية ونبدأ من جديد في التواصل على مستوى بشري مع الحكومات والشعوب. وفي حين أننا نأمل أن رجال الأعمال والطلاب والمسافرين يمثلون أمريكا خير تمثيل، يمكننا أن ندرب السفراء والدبلوماسيين والموظفين القنصليين والعاملين بالتنمية ليحسنوا القيام بعملهم. وفي عالم ما بعد الجائحة في القرن 21 ربما يكون التدريب أهم من أي وقت مدى. كيف ينبغي أن نفعل ذلك؟ هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن نستضيف الدبلوماسيين الأميركيين المرموقين دانيال كيرتسر وباتريك دادي للنقاش حول كيف يمكننا إعداد دبلوماسيين بأكثر الطرق فعالية لتمثيل فكرة أداة أميركا. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The phrase of the day in America is build back better. And that applies to all sorts of things, domestically and internationally. Does it apply also to American diplomacy, to the Foreign Service, which suffered a bit over the past 4 years? To discuss the state of American diplomacy, the Foreign Service, and how our renewed internationalism affects American diplomats, I'm delighted to welcome two of our most experienced, Patrick Duddy and Daniel Kurtzer, ambassadors both. Thank you very much for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington. So, more than a year into the COVID pandemic, embassies and consulates around the world have been shut, consular services suspended. How, in your view, has all this affected American diplomacy? Dan Kurtzer.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to join you. The reality is that American diplomacy for many years has had to reform in several different directions. Number one, our diplomatic stations are understaffed and under budgeted. And we're also moving too slowly into the age of social media and social platforms, which in a way could compensate for the small size of our foreign service. I think COVID, in a sense, created a crisis in this regard, since I'm not sure all of our diplomatic posts have been as prepared as they might have been to deal with their respective publics in other ways than face-to-face. Look, diplomacy should be a person-to-person, face-to-face activity. That's the reason we're 24/7 in the countries where we are represented. But the reality is, if we can't meet people, then we have to find alternative venues, alternative pathways, and that's where an improved social media platform in the Foreign Service generally and at our embassies would help considerably.
And Patrick, how do you think the Foreign Service, our diplomacy, has dealt with the COVID challenge?
Well, in general, I think that many of our embassies have assumed a posture very much like agencies and departments in Washington, which is to say that the majority of staff began working from home some months ago. And as Dan suggests, this has had a particularly serious impact on diplomacy because so much of diplomatic communication happens face to face between and among diplomats at all different levels. I would add to that I've had a long-standing concern with the deterioration of American public diplomacy over time, which dates not just from the Trump administration, but all the way back to the dismantling of the U.S. information agency some years ago, following which seemingly the United States was prepared to cede the business of a dialogue with the world to commercial media or more informal contacts. And I think following in particular the last 4 years, we need to embark on a campaign to rebuild our public diplomacy capability.
So both of you have identified some sort of structural challenges for American diplomacy, social media, public diplomacy. Now, our current situation, in addition to COVID, it was 4 years of a difficult time for the Foreign Service. The Biden administration inherits at a unique moment. How would you evaluate putting aside the COVID challenge, what the new administration inherited after the Trump administration? Patrick, I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's been a gap between what was actually happening in American diplomacy and the way many of our leaders in Washington and elsewhere were talking about it. The U.S. has remained engaged around the world, even as leadership, particularly in the last administration, but not exclusively there, talked up the notion of a kind of American withdrawal. So I think we need to harmonize and coordinate our messages to make sure that, if you will, our direct messaging to foreign publics and governments harmonizes with the meta message. What is it we're actually doing? And I think we're going to need to reintroduce much of the world to the many ways in which the U.S. is engaged with their governments, with international organizations, and in addressing common problems.
Let me ask you about the agent of rebuilding that confidence on behalf of the U.S. government and countries around the world, which is often the ambassador. What makes a good ambassador? You've both been highly successful ambassadors. What makes a good ambassador, especially one who's charged with advocating on behalf of the U.S. government? Dan?
Well, I had the privilege of serving at two of our most important and largest embassies, and the challenges were manifold. On the one hand, just bringing together the various representatives of 15 or 16 agencies of our government on a single platform and moving them in the direction that the president wanted us to move was a management challenge. But as ambassadors are told before they assume their positions, they're supposed to go out as leaders, not necessarily only as managers. And therefore, the question is, how do you translate all of the things we've been talking about, conveying American culture and society and ideas and policies and viewpoints to a foreign audience, understanding that culture in the country in which you live, and adjusting the message in a way that is most likely to be acceptable, or at least to find a place where one can have dialogue. Ambassadors have an enormous number of tools at their disposal if they only want to use them. Not just the normal tools of diplomacy, using our ears and our voices to hear what others have to say and to share our views, but bringing American visitors to talk about our society actually proved to be one of the most successful activities that I engaged in both Egypt and Israel, where I let others speak to the diversity of American opinion and American society, as well as we have, as was suggested, the power of an economy and a military that, in a sense, forces people to listen to us, even if they don't necessarily agree with us, and how we convey those messages in a way that doesn't use a hammer to get across the message. It really becomes the measure of whether we are successful or not in our diplomacy.
And Patrick, what for you is the secret ingredient in a successful ambassador?
Part of it is understanding the way our own government works. Of course, as Dan notes, we're sent out to manage the platform, and embassies can have 10, 15, 20, even a little embassy like Panama, for instance, these days has more than 25 different US government agencies represented. But I think a key is first to reach out to host government officials, key institutions, either directly or through the many people who are present within your embassy, to make sure that those charged with interacting with our country know how to do it successfully. Our government is big, complex. Our society, even bigger and arguably more complex. Interacting with successfully with the American government and people, with states, with municipalities, is a complex undertaking. And I think that an ambassador builds, part of what, one of the ways the ambassador builds credibility is by helping to prepare the country to which he is accredited to deal successfully with our own country.
All right.
I would add one thing if
Dan,
I might.
Dan, hold on for just a second, because we're going to come back after a break. We're going to continue this conversation, and I'm going to ask you whether we should be training our diplomats any differently than when both of you came up in the dark ages of old diplomacy way back in the 20th century. In just a moment.
Baseball is back. After a delay in opening day here in Washington because a half dozen players were exposed to COVID-19, the first pitch was finally thrown and the season has gotten underway. Unlike last year, players will play a full 162 game schedule, but they won't do it in front of a stadium full of fans unless they live in a place like Texas, which is allowing every seat to be filled. In Washington, the limits are pretty tight. Just a few thousand spectators allowed into the 41,000-seat Nationals Park. But it's still baseball, which I think is just terrific. So for those of our viewers who have never watched a game, here's 3 baseball movies that will give you a glimpse of the great American pastime. First, The Natural, a 1984 film, a classic, based on the 1962 novel of the same name by Bernard Malamud. It stars Robert Redford as the fictional Roy Hobbs, a man with amazing natural talent who finally makes it to the major leagues with the help of a bat made from the wood of a tree hit by lightning. It's fantastic. Second is 42, starring the brilliant Chadwick Boseman, who died way too soon. It tells the inspiring story of Jackie Robinson, the first Black player to make it to the major leagues. And then my favorite baseball movie of all time, The Perfect Game, a moving adaptation of the true story of the ragtag team of impoverished kids from Monterrey, Mexico, who miraculously win the 1957 Little League World Series. There are dozens of great baseball movies out there, but you won't strike out with any of these.
Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Our guests again today include Patrick Duddy. Ambassador Duddy is currently a visiting senior lecturer at Duke University, my own alma mater. He served as the American ambassador to Venezuela for both President Bush and President Obama. Previously, Ambassador Duddy served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. He was responsible for the Office of Economic Policy and Summit Coordination, and he played a lead role in coordinating U.S. support for the restoration of democracy in Haiti. Also joining us is Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. Dan Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. During his 29-year career in the Foreign Service, he served as American ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. He was also a member of the State Department Policy Planning Staff, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. All right, Dan, I interrupted you earlier. You were about to come in on a comment about what makes a good ambassador.
I think one of the most interesting challenges for ambassadors is time management. I tended to see my 8 years in the two posts as an opportunity to do as much as possible. And so we showed up at national days of other countries, at local events. We participated in parlor meetings and salons in people's homes. The effort being directed at exposing the United States representative to as many people in Egypt and Israel as possible, and having them see us not just as some exalted representative of a foreign government, but as human beings with our own foibles and habits. Greeting people on the street, the fellow opening the door for us, the doorman, and so forth. And I think that's part of the challenge and the opportunity of being an ambassador, is to also be a human and to show the human side of our own society.
All right, so I know it's, of course, a popular caricature that ambassadors go to ambassadorial training school to learn which fork to use and which spoon to use at state dinners. So we only have a few seconds left. Let me ask both of you to take your magic wand based on your decades of experience. If there's something in the State Department that you want to fix, you want to repair, you want to correct, and you could do it with a swing of your magic wand, what would that be? Patrick, I'll start with you.
What is known as the R Bureau, or the Bureau for Public Diplomacy and Educational Exchange. It needs to be reinvigorated. We need to have a robust presence of people who can reach out to foreign media, to universities, to think tanks, and engage them in the kind of vital conversations that really help advance international understanding.
Okay, very good. And Dan Kurtzer, what would you repair?
Well, I would literally turn the department upside down and empower those responsible for our regional diplomacy as undersecretaries rather than assistant secretaries, who would have at their disposal the assets of all the non-regional bureaus, including special envoys. Right now, we have a bloated and really unusable structure in which you have assistant secretaries for the regions, for functional issues, special envoys, and there's really no way to mediate the process of dealing with diplomacy. I would empower the regional officials in a way that they're not currently empowered, almost like the military has empowered the commanders of the various regional commands.
Fascinating. So very fundamental suggestions from both of you. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion about the Foreign Service, about American diplomacy in the State Department. The value of experience certainly shines through. Thank you very much, ambassadors. From my vantage point, this is a very sensitive moment in America. How the next 100 days plays out could be a turning point for many years ahead. First, COVID. There is a race underway, a race to get Americans vaccinated before the new variants of the virus trigger a terrible new surge of illness and death. Both trends are rising, with light at the end of the tunnel for the millions of us who have gotten shots, while a terrible, deadly spread of the virus in regions, states, and communities rages across our country. Tragically, we will lose some people, but the question is whether we lose an unconscionably large number or we lose just the absolute minimum, and whether our national narrative is about a remarkable scientific achievement or unnecessary, preventable loss. Second, social welfare, infrastructure, taxes, and spending. Passage of a stimulus plan, the American Rescue Act, the largest spending bill in American history, was one thing. Now the Biden administration is planning its next major piece of legislation that could have ramifications for years to come. Part of it is about traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges. Part of it is about the green transformation, electric vehicles. And part of it is about social infrastructure, workforce development, childcare, clean water, expanded broadband. It is a huge bill, one that will be paid with expanded taxes, especially on corporations and wealthy Americans, over the next 2 decades. If approved, and there are compelling voices for and against, it will change the face of our country. And third, voting rights. Across the country, state after state, some that were won by President Trump, some that he lost narrowly, are now considering new laws that will have the effect, if not the intent, of making it more difficult for people to vote, especially people of color. Under the banner of election integrity, efforts are underway to limit access to unconventional voting options, such as early voting, drive-by voting, and to even limit the ability to provide food and water to voters waiting in interminably long lines, triggered by the limitations on the number of voting sites in certain areas. Now, I appreciate that ultimately elections are not about high ideas, but about getting your voters to the polls. That trench warfare is legitimate. What is not legitimate is creating false fears of election fraud and using that to create higher and higher bars for Americans to fulfill their civic duty. Our priorities should flow in the opposite direction, to make it always easier for Americans to vote. These 3 key issues are coming to a head. On some of this, I have strong opinions. On others, I am open to well-intentioned, well-informed debate. But to all our viewers across the Middle East, watch this space, the shape of America, our politics, our society, our health is at a pivotal moment. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول دار السفراء في عصر الفيسبوك وواتساب، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.